The water fuel cell. A man named Stanley Meyer said his car ran on water, and the line between hope and math broke wide open. In 1995, a small group of investors gathered in Grove City, Ohio, watching a dune buggy sputter to life in a modest garage. The only thing in the fuel tank, Meyer told them, was tap water, no gasoline, no hidden fuel line, just H2O, and a device he called a water fuel cell. The room went quiet, and then it went electric. If this was real, the entire petroleum industry had just become a relic. Here is what the device was supposed to do. Water is hydrogen bonded to oxygen. Split them apart, and you get something that burns. That part is real. It is called electrolysis, and it has been understood since the 1800s. The problem, and it is a hard problem, is that splitting water always costs more energy than you get back when you burn the hydrogen. That is not a rule someone made up to protect oil companies. That is thermodynamics, and it has been tested millions of times in labs around the world. Meyer claimed his device broke that equation. A special high-voltage pulse, he said, resonated with water molecules and cracked them apart using almost no energy. If true, he had not just built a clever gadget. He had overturned one of the most tested laws in physics. Investors handed him money. Reporters pointed cameras. And in 1996, an Ohio court handed him a verdict. 2 expert witnesses examined the device, traced every wire, and measured what went in against what came out. Their conclusion was blunt. One expert told the court, "There is nothing here except electrolysis." The cell performed conventional water splitting, dressed up with unusual electronics. There was no resonance miracle. The court ruled it gross and egregious fraud. 2 years later, in March of 1998, Meyer collapsed at a restaurant in Grove City. He was 57 years old. Supporters immediately called it assassination, claiming he had been poisoned by interests that wanted his technology buried. The Franklin County coroner ruled it a cerebral aneurysm. And just like that, the water car stopped being a device and became a martyr story. Martyr stories do not need data to survive. They only need a death and a dream. I want to be honest about something early in this video, because it applies to every single invention we are about to examine. The question is never whether a demonstration looked impressive. Demonstrations are theater. They are designed to impress. The real question is whether the device survives 4 tests. Did an independent lab confirm the results? Was the raw data published for anyone to check? Could someone else build it from scratch and get the same output under blind conditions? And is there a realistic path to manufacturing it safely at scale? Those 4 tests are the wall between a headline and a revolution. Remember them. Not one invention in this video clears that wall. The Wardenclyffe Tower. If the water car is the folktale of this genre, wireless electricity is the gospel. And no name carries that gospel louder than Nikola Tesla. In 1901, on a quiet stretch of Long Island's North Shore, he began building a tower. It stood 187 feet tall, capped with a 55-ton copper dome, and it was meant to do something nobody had ever attempted: send usable electrical power through the atmosphere without wires. No cables strung across continents, no meters ticking in basements. Just a transmitter pulsing energy outward and receivers anywhere on Earth catching it for free. The money came from J.P. Morgan, who wrote a check for $150,000. But Morgan was investing in wireless telegraphy, a way to send messages faster than his competitors. When Tesla quietly expanded the project's ambitions from communication to global power distribution, the relationship cracked. By 1905, the funding dried up. By 1917, the tower was dynamited and sold for scrap to pay debts. A conspiracy was born the moment that tower hit the ground. The banker killed free energy. The physics tells a different story. Broadcasting electricity through the earth or atmosphere over meaningful distances bleeds energy in every direction. The losses are not small. They are catastrophic. Think of it this way: when you throw a pebble into a pond, The ripple spreads in every direction and gets weaker as it travels. Energy broadcast from a tower does the same thing. By the time it reaches a city 100 miles away, almost all of it has dissipated into the ground and the air. You would need to pump absurd amounts of power into the transmitter just to light a single distant bulb. That is not an engineering problem waiting for a smarter solution. That is geometry. Modern wireless charging works because the phone sits directly on the pad, centimeters from the coil. Focused microwave beams can deliver power to satellites, but they require precisely aimed transmitters and receivers, thousands of dollars of hardware, and they still lose significant energy in transit. Neither of these technologies resembles a single tower lighting up the planet. They are precision tools, not broadcast systems. What Tesla actually left behind is far more impressive than the myth people built over his grave. His work on alternating current, polyphase power systems, and high-frequency resonance became the foundation of every electrical grid on Earth. Every motor in every factory, every transformer on every utility pole runs on principles he championed. The induction motor alone transformed manufacturing. His polyphase distribution system is the reason electricity reaches your house reliably instead of flickering out after a few hundred yards. That is not a consolation prize. That is civilization-scale engineering that powers the modern world right now, as you watch this video. But it is not free energy, and the tower was not a suppressed miracle. It was an ambitious experiment that collided with the limits of physics and the patience of financiers. The story persists because the ingredients are irresistible. A lonely genius working late in a half-finished tower. A powerful banker pulling the plug. Workers with dynamite reducing the whole thing to scrap. It writes itself. But physics doesn't care about drama. It cares about geometry, copper, and the hard, unyielding cost of moving an electron from here to there. Yes, speaking of experiments that promised to rewrite physics, nothing electrified the scientific world quite like what happened on March 23, 1989. The cold fusion cell. Two electrochemists named Martin Fleischmann and Stanley Ponce stood at the University of Utah, and Ponce said it plainly. We have established a sustained nuclear fusion reaction. Just like that, on a tabletop. Not inside a reactor the size of a building. Not at temperatures hotter than the sun. In a glass cell full of heavy water with a palladium electrode, sitting on a normal laboratory bench. Everyone in that room understood what it meant. If true, it was arguably the most important scientific discovery since the splitting of the atom. Cheap, clean, nearly limitless energy from equipment a graduate student could assemble. The press called it cold fusion, and the world held its breath. Within weeks, over 100 laboratories around the world scrambled to replicate the experiment. What happened next was one of the most chaotic episodes in modern science. MIT tried and found nothing. Caltech tried and found nothing. Georgia Tech reported positive results, held a press conference of their own, and then quietly retracted everything after discovering an instrumentation error. Labs in Japan, Italy, and India reported small heat anomalies, but always with caveats about measurement uncertainty, always at the ragged edge of what their calorimeters could reliably detect. The scientific community split down the middle, and the arguments turned personal. Careers were staked on positions. Researchers who reported positive results were accused of sloppiness. Researchers who reported negative results were accused of not trying hard enough. The University of Utah, where it all started, found itself in the middle of a reputational crisis. Funding agencies did not know where to place their bets. It was less a scientific controversy than a scientific earthquake, and nobody could agree on how big it actually was. The Department of Energy reviewed the evidence twice. Once in '89, when the excitement was still raw, and again in 2004, after 15 years of quieter follow-up research. Both panels reached the same conclusion. The evidence for cold fusion was not persuasive. That did not mean the question was closed forever. It meant the burden of proof had not been met. A small community of researchers kept working under a new name, low-energy nuclear reactions. They publish papers, hold annual conferences, and some claim genuine progress in excess heat measurements and anomalous isotope shifts. The work is earnest. The results remain elusive. Cold fusion did not die from suppression. It stalled on reproducibility, which is the most scientifically honest way a claim can fail. It's the most heartbreaking way for a miracle to end. Not with a conspiracy, but with a measurement that just wouldn't repeat. Here is where the timeline gets interesting, because another device picked up exactly where cold fusion skepticism left off: the ECAT. In January 2011, in a warehouse in Bologna, Italy, an inventor named Andrea Rossi held a demonstration of a device he called the energy catalyzer. A small reactor chamber held nickel powder and hydrogen gas. Rossi claimed that when heated, and the hydrogen nuclei fused with nickel at low temperatures, releasing enormous energy. The demo showed water flowing in cold and coming out hot, with temperature gauges climbing past what the electrical input alone should explain. Journalists filmed it. Physics blogs dissected it frame by frame. An American company called Industrial Heat inspected the technology, liked what they saw, and invested $11.5 million for the manufacturing rights. That is serious money staked on a serious claim. Then it fell apart. Independent scientists were sometimes allowed to observe tests, but never given full, unrestricted access to the reactor's internals. Measurement setups were questioned by outside experts who pointed to possible errors in how thermal output was calculated. Yes, when Industrial Heat attempted their own internal validation, they said they could not reproduce the claimed performance. A lawsuit erupted in 2016. It ended in a confidential settlement, and the core technical question, does the ECAT actually produce excess heat, was never publicly resolved by neutral arbiters with full access to the hardware. What makes Rossi important is not whether his device works. It is that his story shows how the same pattern adapts to the modern era. Slick demonstrations, media velocity, investor capital, and then an ugly legal fight over whether anyone actually measured the thing properly. If the ECAT works, the path to proof is straightforward. Invite 3 independent labs, give them total access, let them publish everything, and let the world replicate. A decade and a half later, that has not happened. $11.5 million bought a lawsuit, not a reactor. The radiant energy device. Now we go backward in time to a story that plays more like a ghost tale than a technology claim. Thomas Henry Moray was a self-taught electrical engineer in Salt Lake City, Utah, who spent decades tinkering with vacuum tubes, antenna designs, and what he described as radiant energy. His theory was that the universe is filled with a background sea of energy, invisible to normal instruments, but there for the taking if you could build the right receiver. He called his creation the Moray Radiant Energy Device, and he believed it was that receiver. In the 1930s, he began holding demonstrations. A small wooden box sat on a table, connected to a long antenna wire strung out of a window. With no connection to the power grid and no visible batteries, the box appeared to light up a bank of 35 bulbs, some rated at 150 watts each. Witnesses, including a few engineers and several newspaper reporters, described steady bright light that held for hours. The demonstrations were repeated multiple times over several years, in different locations, sometimes outdoors. Each time, the audience reacted the same way: disbelief, followed by stunned fascination. But here's the thing about the 1930s. There were no oscilloscopes in the audience, no calibrated power analyzers, no independent lab teams running standardized protocols and recording every wire and every watt in real time. The evidence we have for Moray's device is eyewitness testimony and newspaper clippings. That is not nothing, and it should not be dismissed with a sneer, but it is also not data, it is memory, and memory is the least reliable instrument in science. Moray's story has a violent edge that makes it unique on this list. He claimed someone shot at him through his laboratory window, and bullet holes in the wall were reportedly shown to visitors. He said a colleague named R.L. Judd smashed a working model with a hammer during a dispute, destroying the device and what Morey described as irreplaceable components inside it. Whether Judd was a saboteur or simply frustrated is impossible to determine from surviving accounts. What is clear is that the destruction conveniently eliminated the most important piece of evidence. Years later, engineers and hobbyists rebuilt devices from his patent filings and surviving descriptions. Some produced minor electrical effects that were eventually traced to radio frequency pickup, conventional induction, or hidden batteries. None produced anything close to the claimed kilowatts of free power from thin air. What Morey's story teaches is not that he was definitely a fraud. It is that demonstrations without instrumented measurement live in a category science simply cannot evaluate. They are legends, not data points. A glowing bulb in a grainy photograph is a beautiful mystery, but you cannot build a future on a memory. And legends, no matter how persistent, have never lit a city. The Repulsine. Its creator, Victor Schauberger, talked like a poet and built things like a man possessed. Born in Austria in 1885, he spent his early life as a forester, watching water the way most people watch fire. With total absorption, he studied how trout held perfectly still in violent rapids with almost no visible effort. He watched how logs moved through natural channels versus man-made flumes. And he became absolutely convinced that nature moved energy through inward, spiraling vortexes, not through the outward explosions that powered human machines. Implosion, he called it, nature's own engine. He designed twisted pipes, spinning chambers, and a device sometimes called the Repulsine. The Repulsine was disc-shaped, about the size of a large dinner table, and it used internal vortex channels to spin air or water at high speed. Schauberger claimed the device could generate lift and propulsion through implosion forces. Some accounts describe prototypes rising unexpectedly from the workbench during tests, though these descriptions come almost entirely from Schauberger himself and a few associates rather than from independent observers. Stories circulate about German military interest during the Second World War. Some researchers claim that Schauberger was pressed into working on propulsion projects, possibly under coercion. The historical evidence for these wartime projects is fragmentary and contested, a mix of secondhand accounts and documents whose provenance is debated. What is more firmly documented is what happened after the war. In 1958, Schauberger traveled to the United States at the invitation of investors who wanted to commercialize his ideas. According to his son, he was pressured into signing a contract that transferred his patents, intellectual property, and all working models to the American group. He returned home to Austria exhausted and disillusioned. According to family accounts, he told his son, "They took everything from me. I do not even own myself." 5 days later, in September of 1958, he was dead. The timing alone is enough to fuel decades of suspicion. But separate the tragedy from the physics, and something more useful emerges. His observations about vortex dynamics, reduced cavitation in pipes, and energy-efficient water flow were genuinely ahead of their time. The trout observation is a perfect example. Fish really do use vortex shedding and subtle body movements to hold position in fast water using minimal energy. Modern engineers study that phenomenon seriously. Pump designers use vortex inlet shapes to reduce wear. River restoration projects mimic natural spiral flows to rebuild habitats. That is a real and valuable legacy rooted in genuine observation of natural systems. But there is a canyon between saying spirals reduce friction in a pipe and saying spirals can replace coal-fired power plants. A better-shaped inlet does not eliminate the need for a primary energy source. Nature constantly inspires better engineering. It has never handed anyone a free lunch that scales to a grid. And somehow, the claims keep getting bigger, even as the evidence keeps getting thinner. the SURL effect generator. A man named John Searle claimed he built something out of magnets that defied both electrical engineering and gravity. Starting in the late 1940s in Wantage, England, he described a device built around a large magnetic ring, which he called the stator, and surrounded by smaller cylindrical rollers arranged along its circumference. The rollers were made of layered materials with specific magnetic properties. According to Searle, when the rollers were set in motion, they would accelerate on their own due to an effect involving electron flow and magnetic field interactions that mainstream physics does not recognize. The claims escalated from there. The spinning assembly allegedly generated continuous electricity that could be drawn off to power external loads. And at higher speeds, Searle said, the entire device would reduce its weight and eventually lift off the ground. He described unmanned disc-shaped craft built around this principle that flew out of his workshop and disappeared over the English countryside. One reportedly rose through his roof, where the story reads like science fiction written by someone who genuinely believes it is a lab report. And that is the fundamental difficulty with evaluating Searle. He is consistent, detailed, and clearly sincere. But sincerity is not evidence. In over 70 years, enthusiast groups in the UK, Russia, the United States, and China have rebuilt devices from his descriptions. Some report brief, curious motion effects that vanish the moment measurement protocols are tightened, and hidden energy sources are eliminated. No independent laboratory has ever confirmed net energy output or anomalous lift. Not once. The community around SURL is passionate and deeply committed. They produce documentaries, fundraise for new prototypes, and maintain the legend with real dedication. But passion is not peer review. And after 7 decades without a single verified confirmation, the SURL effect remains a legend without a lab report. Now, if you are still watching at this point, you might be thinking that every one of these stories ends the same way. No independent data, no replication, no proof. And you would be right. But this next one is different. Not because everything I listed in all these inventions actually worked, but because someone finally agreed to let real scientists test it. The Orbo. In August of 2006, a small technology company called Stiorn, based in Dublin, Ireland, took out a full-page advertisement in The Economist. The ad challenged the global scientific community to test their device, which they said produced free, clean, and constant energy. It was a bold move. It felt like confidence. "Come test us," the company said. "We have nothing to hide." They assembled a jury of 22 independent scientists and engineers from universities and research institutions across Europe. That jury spent 3 years examining claims, reviewing data, and evaluating demonstrations. In 2009, their verdict landed. The jury found that Stiorn had not demonstrated a technology that produced energy. No overunity, no net gain. The tests came up empty under controlled conditions. Stiorn pushed forward anyway. A high-profile public demonstration in London failed when equipment malfunctioned under the heat of stage lights. They tried again with different device iterations. Investor money kept flowing in. Estimates suggest the company raised over 23 million euros across its lifetime before finally dissolving in 2016. What makes this case uniquely valuable is its clarity. A company voluntarily submitted to independent scientific scrutiny. That scrutiny delivered a unanimous negative verdict. That should have resolved the question. Instead, supporters argued the jury was biased, the testing was unfair, and the real version of the device was never properly shown. When negative evidence cannot change a mind, the belief has crossed from science into faith. Faith powers communities. It does not power cities. The magnetic motor. You have seen the videos. A wheel bristling with magnets spins on a tabletop with no visible wires. And the comment section screams that the oil companies are hiding this from you. These clips are the most viral version of the free energy myth. And they are important to understand because they reveal something about how the internet processes technical claims. A 30-second clip of a spinning rotor gets millions of views. A 30-minute explanation of why it does not work gets a few thousand. The ratio is not close. The spectacle wins every time in the attention economy, and that asymmetry is how myths survive in the modern age. The physics is the simplest on this list. Permanent magnets push and pull, but they contain a finite amount of stored energy in their atomic alignment. A clever arrangement can make a rotor spin impressively for a while, the same way a well-made top spins for a while. Friction and air resistance bring it down. Every time. There is no perpetual usable output because there is no perpetual input. That is not theory, and it is something anyone can test on a kitchen table in 15 minutes. What the camera conveniently leaves out is what engineers find when they examine these setups in person. Hidden batteries taped behind the frame, thin wires threaded under the table or through hollow supports, a manual push given just before the recording starts, editing cuts that splice out the 10 seconds when the rotor visibly decelerates. Some creators are pranksters who enjoy the reactions. Others are true believers who genuinely think they have achieved something and cannot see the flaw. And a few are deliberate frauds. Mike Brady belongs in that last category. He marketed a device called the Perendev motor across South Africa and Europe, collected investor money for machines that were supposed to generate free electricity, and delivered nothing that worked. He was arrested and convicted in Germany. His investors lost their money and learned a lesson that every viewer of magnetic motor videos should hear. If the device works, it should not need your investment to prove it. It should need your measurement equipment. There is genuine engineering progress happening in magnetic technology, and it deserves to be separated from the fraud. Stronger permanent magnets made of rare earth elements, lower friction ceramic bearings, and advanced electronic motor controllers produce real, measurable efficiency gains in factories, electric vehicles, and wind turbines. Those gains reduce electricity consumption, and they matter for the climate. But reducing consumption is not the same as generating energy from nothing. A more efficient motor still needs a power source. No arrangement of magnets on a YouTube thumbnail has ever changed that fact. The GEET reactor. Its inventor, Paul Pantone, bolted a homemade device onto a lawnmower engine and told people it could run on practically nothing. The device was called GEET, short for Global Environmental Energy Technology, and the idea behind it was clever enough to sound plausible even to people who should know better. Exhaust gases were routed back through a heated metal tube, where they mixed with incoming fuel vapor. The heat and interaction supposedly cracked the mixture into a hydrogen-rich vapor that burned far more efficiently in the cylinder. Some demonstrations showed engines running, with the fuel supply barely cracked open, and supporters called it a revolution you could build in your garage for the price of plumbing parts. When independent testers brought calibrated fuel flow meters and full exhaust gas analyzers to these demonstrations, the dramatic savings disappeared. What remained was a genuine but modest effect that engineers have understood for decades. Preheating fuel and partially reforming it with waste heat can improve combustion efficiency under certain conditions. That is real thermodynamics. But it is a few percentage points of improvement, not the 90% reduction that the most enthusiastic demos seem to show. Pantone's personal story took a difficult turn when he was eventually committed to a mental health facility. His supporters saw punishment for challenging the energy establishment. Independent reporting painted a more complicated picture involving personal troubles and legal disputes that had nothing to do with suppressed technology. The story became tangled enough that the technology question was buried under the biography. The real science underneath is not nothing. Fuel reforming and exhaust gas recirculation are active, well-funded areas of automotive engineering, and they produce real, verified gains. But a homemade bolt-on box that transforms any engine into a 90% efficiency miracle has never survived calibrated measurement. The gains were real. They were also modest, and modest does not make headlines. So here is where we land after all of these inventions, all of these dramatic demonstrations, And all of these stories that refuse to die no matter how many times the numbers say they should. Every single one of these devices was presented as the answer. The thing that would end our dependence on fossil fuels overnight, eliminate energy poverty, and reshape civilization. And every single one failed the same basic test. Not because a shadowy organization sent agents in the night, not because the oil industry destroyed the prototypes, but because when somebody finally walked into the room with a calibrated instrument and measured what actually went in and what actually came out, the numbers did not support the story. That pattern held across 9 decades, 3 continents, and technologies ranging from water splitting to magnetic levitation. Not one of these devices cleared the most basic bar in science: repeatable, independently verified results published in the open. That is not a satisfying conclusion for people who want to believe. It is so much more exciting to imagine villains than to read a lab report about calorimetry margins and thermal losses. The conspiracy version of history is vivid, dramatic, and emotionally complete. The real version is slow, frustrating, and full of measurement error. One makes a great story. The other is how the world actually changes. Because here is what the suppression narrative always leaves out. Real energy, breakthroughs actually happen. They happen all the time. Solar panels were expensive curiosities in the 1970s that barely powered a calculator. The cost per watt was over $70. Today, it is under 30 cents. Lithium batteries were fragile laboratory experiments in the 80s that no one trusted to run anything important. Now they run cars, grids, and most of the devices in your pocket. Both technologies became civilization-changing forces, not because someone gave one stunning demonstration and then vanished into martyrdom, but because thousands of engineers published their data openly, invited their fiercest rivals to tear it apart, improved the designs in public, and repeated that cycle for decades until the cost curves bent and the world genuinely changed. Nobody suppressed solar panels. People just kept making them cheaper until they won. That is the path from invention to revolution. It is unglamorous. It does not produce good mysteries or compelling martyrs. And it is the only path that has ever actually worked. The difference between a legend and a technology is not drama. It is a spreadsheet full of honest numbers that anyone can check. So the next time someone shows you a machine that could change everything, do not ask for a spectacle. Ask for the data. Ask who tested it and who else confirmed it without being paid to. Ask what happens when you try to build 10,000 of them and run them for 10 years. If those answers exist, you might be looking at the future. If they do not, you are looking at a very good story. And stories, no matter how beautiful, have never powered a single city.